Now today we're going to empower you with the knowledge on how to take back our country one state at a time. As easy as A, B, C. Ratifying these three amendments. A, abolish the IRS and replace the tax code with a consumption tax like the fair tax. B, balance the federal budget. I live in a budget. You live in a budget. 49 out of 50 states live in a budget. Why can't the federal government get it? You with me? Yeah. And lastly, let's compel our government to follow the Constitution. They've been off the reservation for a long time. It's time to put some meat into this stuff here and take back our country. Now we're going to cover tonight now the history of the Article 5, connect all the dots, explain how we got to where we're at today. We're going to explain the process of the Article 5. Also, we're going to explain the myths that are out there. We're going to debunk all the myths so you feel more comfortable. If we say it in Hawaii, feel more better. So this time I want to bring on my colleague, author of The Sword of Liberty, Mr. Loren Enns. Give him back.
Hello, can you hear me? Yep. All right, thank you everybody for coming out tonight. Like Lou said, we are on a 6-state, 10-city tour. It seems like we've been on the road for about 2 months, but we're almost done. We will end up in Boise, Idaho before flying back to Florida. Now, the first question I always ask is that one. How many of you are happy with the way Washington is governing this country? Anybody?
Zero.
Okay, how about the opposite? Anybody unhappy with the way that Washington is governing this country? Well, we're here to talk about reforming the federal government by unleashing the Constitution's greatest power, a power that has never been used before in American history, a power that our founding fathers gave the states worst case scenario if the states need to bypass and reform the federal government. America is at a paradigm shifting crossroads. We have to decide whether we're going to sit back and watch the president and Congress bankrupt this country, or if we are going to pick up the mantle that Ronald Reagan carried for 15 years to 32 states and then laid down when he left office. We need to explore that power before we pick up that mantle and carry it through to the finish line. It is the one thing that Ronald Reagan left undone before or when he left office. And it's up to us to realize that dream for him and carry it through to the finish line. Now, to understand our constitutional power, the power that Reagan tried to get the states to use, ultimately, they got 2 states short of calling this convention. For us to truly use this power, we have to understand it. And to understand it, we first have to understand our founding fathers. They came from a generation that was forced to revolt against British tyranny because their states had no representation in Parliament. You may recall that the Magna Carta gave all Englishmen the right to rally against any taxes that would be put upon them by the king through their representation in Parliament. So when all of a sudden in the 1760s and 1770s, Parliament and the king decided to start taxing the colonies to pay off the French and Indian War, the colonists said, wait a minute, you can't tax us. We haven't been taxed in 150 years that we've existed. And now all of a sudden you're going to tax us without representation? We need representation in Parliament as citizens of the crown. And obviously our founders had to go to war. They had no democratic way to bypass or have their say in Parliament. That forged our founders' belief that the states or the people must have the ability to check federal power. Thomas Jefferson reflected this in the Declaration of Independence. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, when a government becomes self-destructive, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Now, if you think back in history, given the impossibility of giving that power directly to the people, our founders gave that. Our founders established 2 state checks on federal power. Now, the reason why they couldn't give that power directly to the people is you're thinking about the distances back in those times. The state capital was in many cases hundreds of miles from where citizens of that state lived. So they knew that if they were going to hold true to what they said in the Declaration of Independence, they would have to give that power to the states. And then the people could go to their state legislators and, if necessary, bypass and reform the federal government. Now, how did they do that? Well, the first of those 2 state checks was granted in Article 1 of the U.S. Constitution. And it gave the states, the state legislatures more specifically, the right to appoint U.S. senators. Now the thinking was, this was the everyday check on federal power that our founders wanted to have the states to be able to use on a daily basis if needed. They have the right to appoint those senators and hence the right to control them. If the state legislature wanted the 2 U.S. senators to vote yes or no on a certain piece of federal legislation, they would send a directive to Washington to vote this way or that. Now, you think maybe a senator or U.S. senator might want to be a maverick and defy the state? Well, they did so at their own peril, because at the end of their term, the state could either oust them or reappoint them. So if that U.S. senator wanted to continue his, I would say his or her, but we weren't quite that enlightened back then. I don't think there were a whole lot of female U.S. senators then, but imagine if we had that power now. Do you think that we would have ever had Obamacare if the states had the right to check federal legislation through the
John
Senate?
McCain.
Yeah, well, let's not go there. That was the right that our founding fathers intended for the states to have. James Madison confirmed that sentiment in Federalist 62 when he wrote, "The state's right to appoint U.S. senators will guard," and I quote, "against improper acts of federal legislation. No federal law or resolution can now be passed without the concurrence of a majority of the states." Let that sink in. We all know that the 17th Amendment reversed that, and for 100 years the states have not been represented in Congress. Our founders intended for the House to represent the people, the U.S. Senate to represent the states, and the president would lead and represent the people as a whole. And that's why we are where we are, because the states lost their influence in the federal government. Now, the second state check on federal power was meant to be used on a much more irregular basis. This was, we're talking worst case scenario. And that was granted in Article 5 of the Constitution. The states were given exclusive power to propose and ratify amendments. Now just think about that. They didn't give that power to Congress or the President or the Supreme Court. We're talking about the greatest power under the Constitution, the power to alter the very structure. If the states so desired, they could abolish the presidency or the Supreme Court or Congress itself. Now, I'm not saying that we should do that, but that gives you an idea of the power contained within Article 5. That gave the states absolute power over the federal government. Congress can only propose amendments. Ultimately, they have to go to the states, and 38 states have to ratify. So they only trusted that absolute power over the federal government to the states. And it makes sense. They had just had to fight a war against the British government. And so if they were ever going to establish this new national government, they wanted to make sure that the states, if that new federal government were to become destructive or irresponsible, ultimately the states could rein it in, bypass, and reform it. Now, Alexander Hamilton confirmed that sentiment in Federalist 85 when he wrote, "We may safely rely on the disposition of the state legislatures to erect barriers against the encroachments of the national authority." Hamilton was restating what I just went through, and that is ultimately, if the states, ever jealous of their sovereignty, felt that the federal government was getting out of hand, was taxing too greatly, was borrowing too much money in this case, the states ultimately could call a convention, propose an amendment, send it back to the states, and the states could ratify it. And that was the ultimate state check on federal power. Now, how does the Article 5 Convention work? For us to be comfortable with this process, we need to know it inside and out. The first step is that, of course, 2/3 of the states must apply for the convention. So the state legislature, both the House and the Senate, I think Nebraska is unicameral, so they just have a Senate. But either way, they have to pass a resolution through both the House and the Senate in the state calling for a convention to propose one amendment or two or however many that state desires. The more amendments you try to do, the more difficult it is. We are simply going for a balanced budget amendment. Then, Congress must call the convention. Congress's role in this is simply administerial. Our founders essentially wanted there to be a mailbox where the states, once they had applied for a convention, would send their applications, and in fact, in the wording of the state applications, it sends a copy to both the House and the Senate and to the President of the United States. So those will sit in the archives in Washington, D.C. until you reach that 34 state threshold. Then who's going to count them up? Congress does. They say 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way up to 34, and you're done. The House would pass a resolution calling for a convention. The Senate does the same thing. And all they have the power to do is set the time and the place. The third step, well, that would be the state sending delegations, and that would be all 50 states are invited. Not all the states have to go if they don't want. And frankly, there are certain states that I wouldn't care if they didn't come. But that's a whole nother story. Every state is free to attend. The amendment is debated, written, and then proposed with a 26-state majority, minimum majority required. If you think 50 states, 26 would be a majority. And that is one vote per state. We know that because we have precedent within Article 5. In the two instances where a number of states are required, you already have this one here, 2/3 of the states are required to call the convention. California is given no more power to call the convention than South Dakota or Wyoming, or I think Wyoming is actually the least populous state. Also, when we get to the end, 38 states are required to ratify. Again, Wyoming has as much power to ratify as California. So we know that our founders intended for this process to be one state, one vote. All right, so let's say we get 26 states to approve it. That amendment is officially proposed. Then Congress selects the mode of ratification. The first would be through the state legislatures, and that's all but one amendment was actually ratified by the state legislatures. And that's pretty straightforward. Both of the legislative bodies have to approve it. It requires no governor's signature. Neither do the applications. The executive in the state is completely taken out of this process, which could be good or bad depending on how you feel about your governor. I won't go there, no. I think that's probably a sore subject with this crowd. So, what else? There's another option. The Congress can also select conventions in each state called for one specific purpose, and that is to ratify the amendment. Now, the way it would work is the people would be empowered to select the delegates who are going to be sent to this convention. The reason Congress would select the convention method is so that the people can decide on the amendment. So what would happen, for instance, in Florida, under Florida law, there's 67 counties, one delegate would be elected per county. And how are they going to run? What platform are they going to run on? The most simple platform in American history. Yes or no on the amendment. And that gives the people the de facto power to choose whether their state ratifies or not, based upon selecting the delegate who's voting either yes or no. All right, so once Congress selects that mode of ratification, be it the state legislature or the people through the convention, finally, 3/4 or 38 of the states must ratify. And that is the ultimate safeguard. You will hear people talk about a runaway convention and get all in a tizzy over that. Yeah. But ultimately, I go back to 38 states. Republicans control 28 state legislatures, Democrats 17. If the Democrats ever wanted to get through this process, they would need the compliance or the cooperation of 21 Republican states.